Welcome to another journey through the forgotten corners of history, where we explore the daily realities that shaped the lives of ordinary people in extraordinary times. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of medieval manuscripts, ink-stained fingers, and the painstaking dedication of those who preserved knowledge through the darkest centuries of human history. Imagine, if you will, a world without printing presses, where every single book, every carefully crafted letter, had to be written by hand. This was the reality for nearly 1,000 years. And at the heart of this literary universe stood the medieval scribe, a figure both revered and forgotten, whose daily existence was defined by meticulous precision, physical endurance, and an almost monastic dedication to their craft. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore 4 distinct aspects of this fascinating world. We'll begin by immersing ourselves in the daily life of a medieval scribe, experiencing firsthand why this demanding profession would challenge even the most dedicated among us. Then we'll follow the remarkable journey of Alcuin of York, whose influence shaped the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe. We'll delve into the mystery of the Voynich Manuscript, that enigmatic text. Finally, we'll step into the opulent private libraries of medieval nobility, where books were treasures, more valuable than gold. But first, let's begin with you. It's the year 1347, and you've just been accepted as an apprentice scribe, just outside Paris. The morning bell has yet to ring, but already, the cold stone floor beneath your feet seems to steal warmth from your very bones. As you shuffle through the darkness toward the scriptorium, it's still an hour before dawn, but this is your world now. The wooden clogs on your feet echo softly through the corridor, a sound you've learned to muffle lest you wake the brothers who still have another hour of precious sleep before Lords. Your breath forms small clouds in the frigid air as you push open the heavy oak door. The familiar smell greets you immediately: ink, sizing glue, and the lingering traces of yesterday's candle smoke. It's a scent that will follow you everywhere, seeping into your clothes, your hair, even your dreams. Your fingers already ache in anticipation of the day ahead. The scriptorium itself is a marvel of medieval engineering, designed specifically for the delicate work you're about to undertake. Tall, narrow windows line the eastern wall, positioned to catch the first light of dawn. But dawn is still distant, so you must begin by the flickering light, a practice that will strain your eyes in ways you're only beginning. Your workstation awaits. A slanted wooden desk. The angle of the desk is crucial. Too flat and the ink will pool and run. Too steep and it will drip before it can properly set into the parchment. This desk has been positioned precisely to catch the light from the window, and you've learned to work with the sun as it travels across the sky, adjusting your posture and the angle of your work. The parchment before you represents weeks of preparation by other hands. The sheepskin has been soaked, scraped, stretched, and treated with lime to create the smooth. Each sheet represents a significant expense. A single book might require the skins of dozens of animals. The weight of this knowledge presses upon you every time you dip your quill. A single mistake, one careless blot, or misformed letter, Your tools are arranged with the precision of a surgeon. To your right, a small ceramic pot holds your primary ink. The recipe is closely guarded, and the quality of your ink will determine whether your work survives decades or centuries. Too thick, and the quill will clog and skip. Beside the ink pot sits your collection of quills, each one carefully selected and prepared. Goose feathers are preferred for their flexibility and durability, though swan and eagle feathers are reserved for the most prestigious works. Each quill represents hours of preparation, stripping the barbs, curing the shaft, cutting the tip to precisely the right angle and width. You've learned to cut your quills with different tip sizes for different purposes. Broad tips for large, decorative letters. The knife beside your quills serves multiple purposes. It's used for cutting fresh quill tips as they wear down throughout the day, for scraping away mistakes when possible, and for holding down the parchment as you work. The blade must be kept wrapped. A dull knife can tear the delicate parchment or create ragged cuts in your quill tips that will ruin the consistency of your letter. As the first grey light begins to filter through the windows, you prepare for the day's work by mixing fresh ink. The process is almost ritualistic. You measure out the ingredients with the precision of an alchemist. Iron sulfate crystals and a measure of wine or water. The mixture must be stirred carefully to avoid creating air bubbles that could cause the ink to splatter. The color gradually deepens from pale brown to rich black as the chemical reaction takes place. Your first task is to read through the text you'll be copying today. This isn't merely a matter of familiarizing yourself with the content. It's a crucial step in planning your work. You must identify where paragraph breaks occur, where decorated capital letters will be needed, where the rubricator will add red ink for emphasis, and where the illuminator might add decorative borders or miniature illustrations. Every element must be planned in advance, as there's no room for improvisation. The text before you today is a portion of Augustine's Confessions, a work you've copied sections of before, but never in its entirety. The Latin flows in elegant, complex sentences that require careful attention to maintain proper spacing and line breaks. You've learned to read several words ahead as you write, training your mind to process the text, while your hand maintains the steady rhythm of letter forms. As you begin the first line, your hand assumes the position that will define the next 12 hours of your existence. Your writing arm rests on the desk, supported by a small cushion to prevent the sharp edge from cutting off circulation. Your non-writing hand holds the parchment steady and supports your weight as you lean forward to maintain the proper angle for writing. Within the first hour, you'll feel the familiar ache beginning in your lower back. The letters flow from your quill with practiced precision, each one formed according to the strict standards of Carolingian minuscule, into you, since your first day as an apprentice. Every letter must be exactly the same height. The rhythm becomes almost meditative. Dip the quill. Form 3 or 4 letters. The sound of the quill scratching against parchment creates a quiet symphony throughout the scriptorium, as dozens of scribes work in synchronized silence. But this meditative rhythm is constantly interrupted by the demands of your craft. Every few minutes, you must stop to recut your quill tip as it wears down from the abrasive parchment. The ink flow gradually diminishes with use, requiring you to test the flow on a scrap piece Your fingers become increasingly stained with ink. Despite your careful efforts, the stains will become permanent markers of your profession, visible badges of your dedication to the written word. The silence in the scriptorium is not absolute, but carefully modulated. Conversation is forbidden during working hours, but the room fills with its own music. The soft whisper of pages turning, the occasional creak of a stool or desk. The most dreaded sound is the sharp intake of breath, followed by the careful scraping sound as they attempt to remove the offending ink before it sets permanently into the parchment. As the morning progresses, the light from the windows gradually improves, allowing you to extinguish the candles that have been supplementing the natural illumination. But this improvement comes with its own challenges. The angle of the sunlight changes throughout the day, creating shadows that shift across your work surface. You must constantly adjust your position and the angle of your parchment to maintain optimal lighting conditions. Too little light and you strain your eyes. Too much direct sunlight and the parchment becomes hot and difficult to work on, while the ink may dry too quickly. The physical demands of the work become increasingly apparent. Your writing hand develops a persistent cramp from maintaining the precise script required for consistent letter forms. Your fingers become increasingly sensitive to the texture of the parchment, able to detect the slightest variations in surface quality that might cause the ink to behave unpredictably. Your eyes water from the constant focus required to maintain perfectly straight lines and consistent letter spacing. By mid-morning, you've completed perhaps 3 pages of text, a pace that would seem impossibly slow by modern standards, but represents solid progress in the medieval scriptorium. Each page contains roughly 30 lines of text, with each line containing approximately 12 to 15 words, depending on their length and the prescribed spacing. The mathematics of manuscript production are relentless. At this pace, a complete Bible, the monastery bell rings for terce, the 3rd hour of the canonical day. The religious schedule provides structure to your day, marking the passage of time in a world without clocks. But the demands of manuscript production allow little time for extensive prayer breaks. You murmur a brief prayer of gratitude for the morning's progress and ask for steady hands. The parchment before you has begun to warm slightly from the heat of your hand and the proximity of your body, making it more pliable but also more susceptible to tearing if handled roughly. You've learned to work with this change in texture, adjusting the pressure of your quill and the speed of your strokes to accommodate the material's response to environmental conditions. The humidity in the scriptorium affects everything. Too dry and the parchment becomes brittle. Too humid and the parchment softens, while the ink takes longer to dry. The content you're copying requires not just mechanical reproduction. Augustine's complex theological arguments must be preserved with absolute accuracy. As errors in religious texts can have profound implications for doctrine and practice, you find yourself drawn into the philosophical depth of the work, occasionally pausing to reflect on a particularly striking passage. But such moments of intellectual luxury are brief. The pressure to maintain productivity means that contemplation must be reserved for your own time. As you work, you become increasingly aware of the collaborative nature of manuscript production. The parchment you're writing on was prepared by specialists, in the monastery's parchment workshop. The ink you're using was mixed according to recipes developed over centuries and refined by generations of scribes. The text you're copying has been proofread by senior scribes and approved by the monastery's librarian. Once you complete your portion, the manuscript will pass to the rubricator, who will add red ink for chapter headings and emphasis. Your role in this process is simultaneously humble and crucial. You are the vessel through which ancient wisdom flows into new forms. The human link in a chain of knowledge transmission that spans centuries. The weight of this responsibility presses upon you with each carefully formed letter, each precisely spaced word, each perfectly aligned line of text. The monastery bell rings again, marking sext, the 6th hour. Half the day has passed, and your output shows it. Perhaps each one representing roughly 45 minutes to an hour of concentrated effort. Your back aches constantly now. Your eyes are beginning to show the strain of close work in variable lighting, and your writing hand has developed the characteristic deformities that mark experienced scribes. A slight curvature of the fingers from the constant grip on the quill, a callus on the middle finger, where the shaft rests, a permanent ink stain on the thumb and forefinger. The afternoon stretches ahead with the promise of 6 more hours of identical work. The light will gradually fade, requiring the gradual introduction of candles and oil lamps. The quality of artificial light is never quite adequate. For the finest work, creating subtle variations in letter formation as your eyes struggle to maintain the same precision they achieved in the morning's clear sunlight. The silence continues, broken only by the soft sounds of concentrated work. You've learned to recognize the different sounds of manuscript production, the aggressive scratching that indicates someone is attempting to scrape away an error, the careful tapping that means someone is testing the flow of a newly cut quill, the soft rustle that signals the turning of a reference page. And through it all, the constant awareness that tomorrow will bring exactly the same routine, and the day after, and the day after that. For as long as your eyes hold out and your hands remain steady enough to maintain the exacting standards of medieval manuscript production. This is your life now, a life measured in pages completed, one carefully crafted word at a time. The afternoon light slants lower through the windows, and you know that soon you'll need to light your personal candle to continue working. But for now, in this moment between morning and evening, between the completed pages behind you, you are exactly where you belong, at the intersection of human dedication and divine knowledge, creating something that will outlast your own brief existence by centuries. As we leave behind the daily struggles of the anonymous scribes hunched over their parchments, we turn our attention to one man whose influence shaped the very foundation of medieval learning. His name was Alcuin, and though he began life in the northern reaches of Anglo-Saxon England, his intellectual journey would take him to the highest circles of European power and establish him as one of the most important educators in Western history. The story of Alcuin begins not in the grand courts of kings, but in the windswept city of York. Sometime around the year 735, the York of Alcuin's childhood, yet it retained an intellectual vitality that would prove crucial to his development. The Cathedral School of York, where young Alcuin would receive his education, had become one of the most prestigious centres. Picture, if you will, the young Alcuin walking through the narrow streets of 8th century York. The city bore the scars and adaptations of centuries of change. Roman walls repurposed by Anglo-Saxon builders, Christian churches rising where pagan temples once stood, and everywhere the bustle of a thriving commercial centre where merchants from across northern Europe came to trade. But for Alcuin, the most important building in this complex urban landscape was the Cathedral School. The Cathedral School of York was no ordinary educational institution. Under the guidance of masters like Egbert and later Albert, it had developed a curriculum that was revolutionary for its time. While most schools in Europe focused primarily on basic literacy and religious instruction, York's curriculum included not only theology and scripture, but also the classical liberal arts, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry. The school's library was legendary, containing works by classical authors that had been lost in many other parts of Europe. Alcuin entered this intellectual paradise as a young boy, probably around the age of 10 or 12. The school operated on the principle that true learning required not just memorization. Students were expected to master Latin not just as a liturgical language, but as a living tool of communication and thought. They studied the works of Virgil and Cicero alongside the Church Fathers, learning to appreciate the beauty of classical rhetoric, while grounding their studies in Christian doctrine. The daily routine of a student at York would have been rigorous by any standard. The day began before dawn with prayers, followed by lessons that continued with only brief breaks until evening. Students learned to write on wax tablets, practicing their letters and copying passages from the great works in the school's collection. As they advanced, they would graduate to writing on parchment, eventually participating in the creation of new manuscripts for the school's growing library. Alcuin proved to be an exceptional student. His contemporaries noted his quick wit, his phenomenal memory, and his ability to synthesize information from diverse sources. But perhaps more importantly, he displayed the pedagogical instincts that would later make him one of the most sought-after teachers in Europe. Even as a young student, he showed a talent for explaining complex concepts to his fellow pupils, breaking down difficult passages of scripture. Under the tutelage of Alba, who had succeeded Egbert as head of the school, Albert was not just a scholar but also a collector, and he had spent years traveling throughout Europe, gathering manuscripts and establishing connections with other centers of learning. Through Albert, Alcuin was exposed to the broader intellectual currents of his time. The relationship between master and student was particularly close. In Alcuin's case, Albert recognized exceptional talent and took personal responsibility for nurturing it. He introduced Alcuin to the art of manuscript collection and preservation, teaching him not just to read and write, but to understand the physical processes of book production. Alcuin learned to evaluate the quality of parchment, to mix inks that would last for centuries. As Alcuin matured, he began to take on teaching responsibilities within the school. This was the traditional path for promising students. They would gradually transition from pupil to instructor, eventually taking over full responsibility for certain subjects. Alcuin proved to have remarkable. He could explain complex theological concepts in ways that made them accessible to students of varying abilities, and he had an intuitive understanding of how to structure curriculum to build knowledge systematically. But Alcuin's talents extended beyond the classroom. He was also a gifted administrator, helping Albert manage the complex logistics of running a major educational institution. The Cathedral School of York was not just a place of learning, but also a center of manuscript production, a library, and a hub of correspondence with scholars throughout Europe. Managing such an institution required skills in personnel management, financial planning. When Albert decided to make a pilgrimage to Rome in 766, he chose Alcuin to accompany him. This journey would prove to be a turning point in Alcuin's life, exposing him to the broader world of European scholarship and establishing connections that would shape his future career. The journey itself was arduous, taking them through Francia and over the treacherous Alpine passes. But it provided Alcuin with first-hand experience of the political and intellectual landscape of continental Europe. In Rome, Alcuin encountered a level of scholarly sophistication. The papal library contained manuscripts that existed nowhere else in Europe, and the scholarly community included refugees from across the continent who had fled various political upheavals. Alcuin spent months copying important texts and engaging in debates with some of the most learned men of his time. The return journey from Rome brought an unexpected encounter that would change Alcuin's life forever. In the northern Italian city of Parma, the travelers met a Frankish embassy that included several scholars in the service of Charlemagne. These men were impressed by Alcuin's learning and his reputation, which had preceded him even to the continent. They invited him to visit the Frankish court, an invitation that Alcuin initially declined. Back in York, Alcuin found himself increasingly taking on the responsibilities of leadership. When Albert died in 778, at barely 40 years of age, he found himself in charge of one of Europe's most important educational institutions. Under his leadership, the school continued to flourish, attracting students from across Britain, but Alcuin's reputation had spread far beyond the borders of North. His correspondences with scholars throughout Europe had established him as one of the leading intellectual figures of his time. His poems, treatises, and letters circulated widely when Charlemagne began his ambitious program of educational reform. It was perhaps inevitable that he would seek out the Master of York. The invitation came in 781, delivered by envoys, who made it clear that this was not merely a request. Charlemagne, king of the Franks and future emperor of the West, was embarking on what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance, a systematic effort to revive learning and culture throughout his vast domains. He needed the best minds available to help him achieve this goal, and Alcuin's reputation made him an obvious choice. The decision to leave York cannot have been easy for Alcuin. He was abandoning not just his position and his students, but also his homeland and the intellectual community that had shaped his entire life. The Cathedral School of York had been his world for over 40 years, and leaving it meant stepping into the unknown. But the opportunity to serve Charlemagne also represented a chance to influence education on a scale that would have been impossible from York. Alcuin's arrival at the Frankish court in 782 marked the beginning of the most influential phase of his career. Charlemagne installed him as head of the palace school, an institution that served not only to educate the royal family and court officials, but also to train teachers who would carry educational reforms throughout the empire. The palace school was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in Europe. It was simultaneously a center of learning. The challenge facing Alcuin was enormous. The Frankish kingdom had expanded rapidly under Charlemagne's predecessors and under Charlemagne himself. But this expansion had not been accompanied by corresponding developments in education and culture. Most of the population, including many of the nobility, were illiterate. The clergy, who theoretically should have been the guardians of learning, often barely understood the Latin texts. Manuscript production was haphazard and often of poor quality, with errors multiplying as texts were copied by scribes who didn't understand. Charlemagne's vision was breathtaking in its scope. He wanted to create an empire that would rival the greatest achievements of the ancient world. But he understood that such an empire required more than military conquest. It required an educated populace, competent administrators, and a revival of the arts and sciences. The palace school was to be the starting point for this cultural renaissance, and Alcuin was to be its architect. Working 18-hour days, Alcuin began the systematic restructuring of education. He developed new curricula based on the 7 liberal arts, created textbooks that would be used throughout the empire, and established standards for manuscript production that would ensure accuracy and consistency. But perhaps most importantly, he trained a generation of teachers who would carry these reforms to monasteries. The intellectual circle that formed around Alcuin at the palace school was extraordinary. Students included not only Charlemagne's own children, but also young nobles from throughout the empire, promising clerics selected for advanced training, and scholars who came from distant lands to study under the master from York, with constant debates, discussions, and intellectual competitions that pushed everyone. Alcuin's relationship with Charlemagne himself was complex and fascinating. The king was genuinely committed to learning and spent considerable time in the palace school, participating in lessons and debates despite the enormous demands of ruling a vast empire. Charlemagne had learned to read, but struggled with writing, and Alcuin spent countless hours working with him on his penmanship. The correspondence between the two men reveals a relationship that was simultaneously formal. Under Alcuin's guidance, the palace school became the center of a network that extended throughout Europe and beyond. Alcuin maintained correspondence with hundreds of scholars, sharing resources, coordinating research projects, and facilitating the exchange of manuscripts. He established standards for copying that ensured the preservation of classical and patristic texts, and he personally supervised the creation of corrected editions of the Bible and other essential religious works. The famous Carolingian minuscule script, which would become the standard for manuscript production throughout medieval Europe. This elegant, readable script represented a revolution, making texts more accessible and reducing the errors that had plagued earlier copying efforts. The development of this script alone would have secured Alcuin's place in history, but it was just one element of his comprehensive reform program. As the years passed, however, Alcuin began to feel the weight of his responsibilities. The constant travel required to oversee educational reforms throughout the empire, the endless correspondence with scholars and administrators, and the demanding schedule of teaching and writing began to take their toll. By his 70th year, he was suffering from recurring illnesses and found the winters. In 796, Alcuin made the decision. He requested permission from Charlemagne to retire from active service and was granted the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours, one of the most prestigious and wealthy monasteries in Francia. This appointment was both a reward for his years of service and a recognition. His influence would continue to be felt throughout the empire. The transition from the bustling intellectual environment of the palace school to the quieter routine of monastic life. Tours was certainly no intellectual backwater. It had its own distinguished school and an excellent library, more conducive to contemplation and sustained scholarly work. For the first time in decades, Alcuin had the luxury of pursuing his own research interests. At Tours, Alcuin returned to his roots as a teacher and scholar. He reorganized the monastery's school along the lines he had developed at the palace school, creating a curriculum that balanced religious instruction with classical learning. He supervised the creation of a new library, personally selecting and copying many of the texts that would form its foundation, and he continued his extensive correspondence, maintaining the networks of scholarship he had spent decades building. But perhaps, most importantly, Alcuin used his time at Tours to consolidate. He wrote comprehensive guides for teachers, created standardized textbooks, and established procedures for training new educators. His goal was to ensure that the Renaissance he had helped to create would survive his own death and continue to flourish in future generations. The final years of Alcuin's life were marked by a sense of accomplishment. He could see the fruits of his labor throughout Europe, schools flourishing in places where ignorance had once reigned, manuscripts being copied with unprecedented accuracy, and a new generation of scholars carrying forward the work he had begun. But he also understood that the progress was fragile, dependent on continued support from rulers who might not share Charlemagne's commitment to learning. Alcuin died at Tours on May 19th, 804, surrounded by his students and fellow monks. His death marked the end of an era, but his influence would continue to shape European education for centuries to come. The schools he had established, the curricula he had developed, and the standards he had set would provide the foundation for the great medieval universities that would emerge in later centuries. The story of Alcuin reminds us that the preservation and transmission of knowledge depends but on the dedication of individual scholars who commit their lives to teaching. From his humble beginnings in York to his influential years at Charlemagne's court to his final peaceful years at Tours, Alcuin embodied the highest ideals of medieval scholarship. The belief that learning was not just a personal pursuit but a sacred duty to preserve and pass on the wisdom of the ages. In the shadowy world of medieval manuscripts, where every text tells a story of painstaking human effort and centuries of careful preservation, there exists one book that defies all explanation. It sits in Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book Library, Catalogue number MS 408. Its vellum pages filled with texts that no scholar has ever successfully deciphered, illustrations that depict plants unknown to botany. This is the Voynich Manuscript, named after the Polish antiquarian book dealer Wilfrid Voynich, who acquired it in 1912 from the Jesuit Collegio Romano. But long before Voynich laid eyes on this enigmatic codex, it had already traveled through centuries of mystery, passing from hand to hand, library to library, always tantalizing scholars with its promise of hidden knowledge, while steadfastly refusing to yield its secrets. The story of the manuscript's modern discovery reads like something from a medieval romance. In 1912, Wilfrid Voynich was browsing through a collection of manuscripts Jesuit order was quietly selling to raise funds for their operations. The collection had been housed in the Villa a 16th century villa in the hills outside Rome. Among the more conventional religious texts and classical works, Voynich found something extraordinary. The book itself is modest in size, measuring roughly 9 by 6 inches, but its contents are anything but modest. It consists of about 240 vellum pages, though experts believe that perhaps another 28 pages have been lost over the centuries. The manuscript is written in what appears to be a consistent script, flowing from left to right in neat lines, but the characters bear no resemblance to any known alphabet or writing system. The text is interspersed with elaborate illustrations that are simultaneously beautiful and baffling. Carbon dating performed in 2009, 1404 and 1438, placing the manuscript firmly in the early 15th century. But this dating only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The early 1400s were a time of great intellectual ferment in Europe, with scholars rediscovering classical texts, explorers bringing back knowledge from distant lands. Yet nothing from this period resembles the Voynich Manuscript. The manuscript is traditionally divided into several sections based on its illustrations, each apparently dealing with different subjects. The largest section, comprising about half the manuscript, appears to be botanical in nature. Page after page displays detailed drawings of plants, each accompanied by text in the mysterious script. But here lies one of the manuscript's greatest puzzles. Despite the careful detail of the illustrations, botanists have been unable to identify most of the plants depicted. Some bear vague resemblances to known species, but with strange modifications or combinations of features. The botanical illustrations are rendered with the kind of careful attention to detail that suggests the artist was working from life, observing actual specimens. The root systems are depicted with particular care, showing the complex networks of fine roots that would only be visible to someone who had actually uprooted and examined the plants. The leaves are shown in various stages of growth and decay, with careful attention to how they attach to stems and branches. Yet for all this apparent naturalism, the plants themselves seem to inhabit a world that never was. Consider, for instance, the plant on folio 33R, which appears to be some sort of flowering herb. The root system is depicted with meticulous detail, showing a complex network of tubers and runners that suggests a plant adapted to difficult growing conditions. The stem rises in a natural curve, supporting leaves that are carefully shaded, but the flowers themselves are unlike anything in the botanical record. They appear to be large. The second major section of the manuscript is equally puzzling. These pages contain what appear to be astronomical and astrological diagrams, featuring circles, stars, and zodiacal symbols, intermixed with the same mysterious text. Some of the diagrams show clear astronomical phenomena, the phases of the moon, the movement of celestial bodies, calendrical calculations, but others depict cosmological concepts that don't correspond to any known system of medieval astronomy. One particularly intriguing diagram shows a series of concentric circles with various symbols and text scattered throughout. The arrangement suggests some kind of cosmological model, perhaps depicting the structure of the universe or the relationship between celestial, but the specific symbols and their arrangement don't match any known astronomical tradition. Whether European, Islamic, or from other cultures, The manuscript's third section is perhaps the most enigmatic of all. These pages contain what can only be described as biological or pharmaceutical diagrams, showing human figures, mostly women, immersed in various kinds of baths or pools. The figures are drawn in a simple, almost childlike style, but the apparatus surrounding them is depicted with considerable technical detail. Pipes, vessels, and channels connect the various pools, suggesting some kind of complex hydraulic system. These balneological pages, as scholars have termed them, have generated numerous theories about the manuscript's purpose. Some suggest they depict medieval spa treatments or medical procedures. Others propose they might represent alchemical processes, with the human figures serving as symbols for various chemical transformations. Still others wonder if they might be related to medieval concepts of reproduction and fertility. But perhaps the most maddening aspect of the Voynich manuscript is its text. The mysterious script flows across the pages with the confidence of a living language, complete with what appear to be paragraphs, sentences, and even individual words. Statistical analysis of the text reveals patterns that are consistent with natural language. Some combinations of characters appear frequently, while others are rare. Yet despite decades of intensive study by some of the world's most accomplished cryptographers and linguists, the text remains completely unreadable. The characters themselves are unlike any known alphabet, though they bear some superficial resemblances. Some characters appear to be derived from Latin letters, others from Greek, and still others seem to be completely original inventions. The mystery deepened during World War II, when the manuscript came to the attention of William Friedman. Friedman, who had broken some of the most sophisticated codes of his era, assembled a team of experts to tackle the Voynich text. For decades, they applied every known technique of cryptographic analysis, but the manuscript stubbornly refused to yield its secrets. Computer analysis in the modern era has revealed even more intriguing patterns. The text appears to have a structure that linguists call Zipfian distribution, meaning that the frequency of words follows a pattern typical of natural languages. The most common word in the Voynich text appears about twice as often as the second most common word, which appears about twice as often as the third most common word, and so on. This pattern is characteristic of all known natural languages, but it could also be the result of a very sophisticated artificial language or cipher. More puzzling still is the apparent repetitive nature of much of the text. Certain character combinations appear over and over again, sometimes in long sequences that seem to serve no obvious purpose. This has led some scholars to suggest that the manuscript might be a form of glossolalia, mystical utterances that follow the rhythms of language without necessarily conveying conventional meaning. The manuscript's provenance adds another layer to the mystery. The letter found with the manuscript, when Voynich acquired it, purported to be from Johannes Marcus Marci, rector of the University of Prague. Writing to the Jesuit scholar, Marci claimed that the manuscript had once belonged to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who had supposedly paid the enormous sum of 600 ducats for it, believing it to be the work of the medieval philosopher Roger Bacon. Rudolf II, who ruled from 1576 to 1612, was known for his interest in the occult sciences and his patronage of alchemists. His court in Prague was a magnet for scholars and mystics from across Europe, and his library contained one of the largest collections of esoteric texts in the world. The idea that such a manuscript might have found its way into Rudolph's collection is entirely plausible. Roger Bacon, who lived from approximately 1220 to 1292, was indeed a remarkable figure in medieval science and philosophy, known as Dr. Mirabilis, for his encyclopedic learning and experimental approach to natural philosophy. Bacon was ahead of his time in many ways. He wrote extensively on optics, mathematics, and experimental method, and he was one of the first European scholars to seriously study it. But the Voynich Manuscript dates from nearly 2 centuries after Bacon's death, making the attribution chronologically impossible. This has led to numerous alternative theories about the manuscript's origins. Some scholars have suggested it might be the work of a medieval physician or herbalist, recording medical knowledge in a deliberately obscure cipher to protect trade secrets. Others propose it might be an early work of experimental science, documenting observations and theories that were too radical for open publication in the medieval period. One particularly intriguing theory suggests that the manuscript might be connected to the a religious sect that flourished in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. The Cathars were known for their esoteric beliefs and their secretive practices, and they developed sophisticated codes and ciphers to protect their teachings from orthodox persecution. The theory proposes that the Voynich Manuscript might be a later compilation of Cathar wisdom, preserved in coded form. Another theory focuses on the manuscript's possible connection to medieval alchemy. The combination of botanical, astronomical, and what appear to be pharmaceutical sections would be consistent, which sought to understand the hidden connections between all aspects of the natural world. The mysterious text might represent a form of alchemical notation. More recent scholarship has explored the possibility that the manuscript might be connected to the Aztec or other Mesoamerican cultures. Some of the botanical illustrations bear resemblances to New World plants that wouldn't have been known in Europe. Speculation that the manuscript might be based on indigenous American knowledge, perhaps recorded by an early explorer or missionary who developed his own system of notation to record indigenous medical or botanical practices. The astronomical sections of the manuscript have also generated considerable scholarly debate. Some of the diagrams appear to show knowledge of celestial phenomena that wouldn't have been widely known in medieval Europe. The careful attention to lunar phases and the apparent tracking of planetary movements, but the specific combinations of symbols and calculations don't match any known astronomical tradition. Perhaps most frustrating of all is the sense that the manuscript seems to be on the verge of revealing its secrets. The text has the feel of a language that should be decipherable. The illustrations depict scenes that seem familiar yet strange, and the overall structure suggests a systematic presentation of knowledge that follows logical principles. Yet every attempt to unlock the manuscript's meaning has ended in failure, leaving scholars with tantalizing glimpses of what might be profound wisdom. The digital age has brought new tools to bear on the Voynich mystery. High-resolution imaging has revealed details invisible to earlier scholars, including evidence of corrections and layering in both text and illustrations. Computer analysis has identified statistical patterns in the text that might provide clues to its structure. Artificial intelligence systems have been trained on the manuscript's text and imagery. Yet, despite all these technological advances, the manuscript remains as mysterious as ever. If anything, modern analyses has revealed new layers of complexity that make the puzzle The manuscript appears to be internally consistent. The same mysterious alphabet is used throughout. The artistic style is uniform, and the various sections seem to be the work of a single author. But this consistency only makes the mystery deeper, as it suggests that whoever created the manuscript, the Voynich Manuscript, stands as perhaps the ultimate reminder, an experience that remains largely inaccessible to us. Whether it represents the work of a brilliant individual working in isolation, the last remnant of a lost tradition of knowledge, or something else entirely, it continues to challenge our assumptions about what medieval people knew and how they recorded their understanding of the world. And so the manuscript sits in its climate-controlled case at Yale, its vellum pages bearing witness to human curiosity and ingenuity, while steadfastly guarding whatever secrets they might contain. It remains a testament to the profound mystery that can lurk within even the most mundane-seeming medieval manuscript, reminding us that for all our advances in scholarship and technology, the past retains the power to From the mysterious depths of undeciphered manuscripts, we now ascend to a very different world, one of silk tapestries, golden illuminations, and books so precious they were literally worth more than castles. This is the realm of the medieval noble's private library, where books were not merely repositories of knowledge but symbols of power, prestige. Here, in chambers designed specifically for the intimate enjoyment of the written word. To understand the significance of a noble's private library in medieval times, we must first appreciate the extraordinary value of books in an age before printing. A single illuminated psalter might cost as much as a knight's full equipment for war. A complete Bible could easily equal the price of a manor house with all its furnishings. This was not merely a matter of the materials involved, though the finest vellum, gold leaf, and precious pigments were indeed costly, but also of the enormous investment of human time and skill required to create each volume. Consider the library of Jean, Duke of Berry, brother to King Charles V. The Duke's collection, housed in his various residences throughout France, represented perhaps the finest assemblage of illuminated manuscripts ever created. Each book in his collection was a masterpiece of artistic achievement, commissioned from the greatest illuminators of his time, and bound in covers. The Duke's most famous commission was The Riches Heirs, a book of hours created by the Limbourg brothers between 1412 and 1416, with its revolutionary use of perspective and its detailed depictions of seasonal activities, represented the pinnacle of medieval book illustration. But it was just one volume among hundreds in the Duke's collection, each chosen. The physical environment of a noble's library was designed to enhance both the preservation of these precious volumes and the experience of reading them. Unlike the austere scriptoriums, where books were copied, or the communal libraries of monasteries, where manuscripts were chained to reading desks, the private libraries of the nobility were intimate spaces designed for personal contemplation. Picture yourself entering the private reading chamber of Charles V of France, known as Charles the Wise. In his palace of the Louvre around 1370, the room is relatively small, perhaps 20 feet square, but every detail has been crafted to create an atmosphere of learned luxury. The walls are lined with wooden armoires, their doors carved with intricate Gothic tracery and fitted with elaborate locks. These cupboards, or armoires, house the king's collection of nearly 1,000 manuscripts, an almost unimaginable treasure trove for the 14th century. The lighting in such a room was crucial, as most reading took place during daylight hours to avoid the risk of fire damage to irreplaceable manuscripts. Large windows, fitted with clear glass, itself a luxury beyond the reach of most medieval people. Ample natural light, while protecting the books from weather. The glass is often tinted or treated to reduce the harmful effects of direct sunlight on the delicate pigments and inks used in manuscript illumination. Near the window stands a reading lectern, its slanted surface. This lectern is adjustable, allowing the reader to position manuscripts at the optimal angle for comfortable viewing. The mechanism is a marvel of medieval engineering, with brass fittings and precisely balanced counterweights that allow even heavy volumes to be positioned effortlessly. The books themselves are stored with meticulous care. Each volume is wrapped in silk or fine linen, both to protect it from dust. The most precious manuscripts are kept in individual cases, often made of carved ivory. These cases are works of art in their own right, decorated with scenes that complement the content of the manuscripts they protect. The ritual of retrieving and reading a book in such a library was elaborate and ceremonial. Servants specially trained in the handling of manuscripts would carefully remove the chosen volume from its storage case, unwrap it with ritual precision, and present it to their master or mistress on a cushioned tray. The reader's hands would be washed and dried before touching the manuscript, and special silk gloves might be worn to prevent oils from the skin from damaging the delicate pages. The books themselves were objects of breathtaking beauty that elevated the act of reading into an aesthetic experience. The Psalter of St. Louis, created around 1260, exemplifies the luxury manuscripts found in royal collections. Each page is written in the finest Gothic script, with initial letters that explode into gardens of gold and ultramarine blue. The margins are populated with fantastic creatures: dragons, griffins, and hybrid beings that seem to dance around the sacred text. The binding is covered in silk and decorated with precious stones arranged in patterns that mirror the illuminations within. But these libraries contained more than just religious texts. The nobility of the later medieval period were increasingly interested in secular literature, history, and practical knowledge. The Library of Charles V included works of philosophy by Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, historical chronicles, treatises on governance and law. This represented a significant shift from earlier centuries when noble collections consisted almost entirely of religious manuscripts. The process of commissioning new manuscripts for these collections was itself a form of noble entertainment. A great lord might spend months working with scribes and illuminators to plan a new project, selecting texts, choosing decorative themes, and specifying particular artistic treatments. The Duke of Berry was famous for his detailed involvement in every aspect of manuscript production, often requesting changes and additions that pushed his artists to new heights of creativity. The commissioning process began with the selection of texts, often guided by the latest intellectual fashions at court. A nobleman might decide to commission a new copy of Dante's Divine Comedy, for instance, Influenced by the growing reputation of Italian literature, the text would first be carefully prepared by scholarly scribes, who would consult multiple sources. This preparatory work might take months, as medieval texts often existed in multiple versions. Once the text was prepared, the real artistic work would begin. The illuminator would create preliminary sketches for the major decorative elements, working closely with the patron to ensure that the imagery reflected both the content of the text and the specific tastes and interests of the commissioner. These sketches might go through multiple revisions as patron and artist refine their vision for the finished work. The actual creation of the manuscript involved a complex choreography of specialized craftsmen. The scribe would lay out the text, leaving carefully calculated spaces. The illuminator would then add the major pictorial elements, often working from detailed preliminary drawings. Finally, the rubricator would add red ink for emphasis and navigation, and the manuscript would be ready for binding. The binding of luxury manuscripts was an art form in itself. The covers might be made of ivory, carved with religious or secular scenes, or of precious metals. The most expensive bindings incorporated gems. The binding of the Codex Aureus of St. Emmerem, created around 870, includes over 100 pearls and numerous precious stones arranged in intricate patterns around a central ivory plaque. The social aspect of these libraries was equally important. Reading in the medieval noble household was often a communal activity, with family members and honored guests gathering to hear particularly interesting or entertaining texts. The physical arrangement of the library reflected this social dimension, with comfortable seating arranged to accommodate small groups of listeners. The illuminated manuscripts themselves were designed with this oral tradition in mind. The large, elaborate initials that began each section served not only as decoration, helping to navigate the text during public recitation. The illustrations provided talking points and aided comprehension for listeners who might not be fully literate themselves. Book collecting among the medieval nobility was also a form of diplomacy and international communication. Manuscripts were exchanged as gifts between royal courts, carrying with them not only their textual content, but also demonstrations of the artistic sophistication of their creators. The wedding of Isabella of Valois to Richard II of England in 1396, manuscripts that helped establish cultural connections between the French and English courts. The libraries of medieval nobles also served practical functions beyond mere display. Legal texts, genealogical records, and administrative documents were carefully preserved. The Duc de Berry's collection included detailed inventories of his possessions, maps of his territories, and legal documents establishing his various rights. These practical manuscripts were often less elaborately decorated than the luxury items. The maintenance of these collections. Specialized servants were employed solely to care for the manuscripts, checking them regularly for signs of damage, ensuring proper storage conditions, and making minor repairs as needed. The most valuable manuscripts might be inspected monthly, with detailed records kept of their condition and any conservation work performed. Climate control in medieval libraries was achieved through careful architectural planning. The rooms were positioned to avoid extremes of temperature and humidity, often located in interior parts of buildings where they would be protected from weather fluctuations. Braziers or fireplaces provided heat during cold months, but these were used sparingly. In summer, thick walls and small windows helped maintain cool temperatures. The decline of these magnificent private libraries came with the social and technological changes. The invention of printing in the mid-15th century gradually reduced the prestige value of manuscript books, while political upheavals scattered many collections. The Library of Charles V was largely dispersed, with individual manuscripts ending up in collections across Europe. Yet even as the era of the great noble libraries came to an end, their influence on European culture was profound and lasting. The patronage system that supported manuscript illumination helped establish artistic traditions. The texts preserved in these collections provided the foundation for Renaissance humanism and the revival of classical learning. And the very concept of the private library as a space for contemplation and intellectual pleasure established patterns of book collecting and reading that persist to this day. The medieval noble library represents perhaps the ultimate expression of the book as a luxury object and cultural symbol. In these carefully curated collections, housed in chambers designed specifically for their preservation and enjoyment, we see the transformation of reading from a purely utilitarian activity into a form of aesthetic. These libraries remind us that even in an age when books were rare and precious, there were those who recognized their power, not only to inform and educate. As we conclude our journey through the world of medieval manuscripts, from the humble daily struggles of the scriptorium scribe to the intellectual achievements of Alcuin of York, from the enduring mystery of the Voynich Manuscript, we are reminded of the extraordinary human dedication required to preserve and transmit knowledge across the centuries. Each carefully formed letter, each preserved text, each illuminated page represents not just information. In our modern world of instant digital communication and unlimited access to information, it is worth remembering these medieval pioneers who understood that knowledge is precious and that the act of preserving wisdom for future generations is among the highest callings of human civilization. Their legacy lives on not only in the manuscripts that survive in our libraries and museums. In whatever form they take, remain among humanity's greatest treasures. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of medieval manuscript culture. May your dreams be filled with the quiet scratching of quills on parchment, the soft glow of illuminated letters, and the timeless satisfaction of knowledge. Rest well, knowing that somewhere in the great libraries of the world, waiting to share their secrets with future generations of curious minds,